Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a totally impartial but incredibly deep dive into a really provocative and complex legal argument. We are going to break down a fascinating critique of the modern Supreme Court's interpretation of birthright citizenship. This comes from a piece titled The Jurisprudence of Squatter Citizenship. And look, regardless of where you stand politically, understanding the actual mechanics of this constitutional argument is absolutely vital. The author is essentially claiming that our current legal interpretations collapse the fundamental difference between invited members of a community and those who bypass the rules, which, in their view, completely redefines American sovereignty in the process.
Okay, let's dive into this. To truly grasp the author's argument, we're going to deconstruct it step by step through 6 key areas. We'll start with subjects versus citizens, then defining the jurisdiction. After that, we'll hit the squatter analogy, the diplomat contradiction, the historical context, and finally, consent and self-rule. Section 1. Subjects versus citizens.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the author roots this entire critique all the way back in the foundational philosophy of the American Revolution. They contrast two totally different worldviews. On one side, you've got the Old English subject model. Under that system, you're a passive subject. You owe perpetual allegiance to a king just because of the physical soil you happen to be born on. But on the other side is the American citizen model. This was built as a conscious rejection of that English system. Citizenship in this model is viewed as a covenant. You're equal members of a self-governing community united by mutual consent and reciprocal obligations. The author argues that by granting automatic citizenship based purely on physical location at birth, the modern court is accidentally resurrecting that rejected monarchical model of the passive subject.
Section 2. Defining the jurisdiction. So that philosophical clash between subjects and citizens doesn't just float around in the abstract, right? It plays out directly in the text of the Constitution. Listen to this famous line from the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause: born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. According to our source material, this massive historical and legal debate hinges entirely on those last 6 words. What does it actually mean to be subject to the jurisdiction thereof? So the crucial point is that there are 2 totally diverging interpretations. The author argues the Supreme Court adopted what they call a superficial reading, basically interpreting it to mean mere physical presence. If you can be arrested by local police, you're subject to the jurisdiction. But critics of this, like modern legal scholar John Eastman and even the original framers of the amendment like Senator Lyman Trumbull, they argue for a full allegiance reading. This means complete political submission to the nation's laws, owing allegiance to no other foreign power. The critique here is that individuals who enter the country unlawfully have, by definition, not fully submitted to the community's jurisdictional authority, and therefore they shouldn't trigger this clause. Section 3. The squatter analogy. And this brings us to a brilliantly vivid metaphor the author uses. They ask us to think of citizenship as a sacred form of political property, the collective right of self-government. Now imagine someone breaks into a house undetected. That's unlawful entry. Step 2, they stay long enough to give birth in the kitchen. And step 3, under the current legal logic, that child instantly becomes a co-owner of the home with claims exactly equal to the actual family members who built it. The author uses this squatter analogy to demonstrate what they see as a fundamental, glaring flaw in the legal framework. The author spells out their moral intuition on this pretty clearly, stating, a legal regime that allows unlawful entry to ripen into the highest status the polity can confer converts illegality into a path to superior entitlements. They're basically pointing out that in literally any other property context, rewarding an initial trespass with the absolute highest privilege, especially without the legislative consent of the community, would be considered legally and logically perverse.
Section 4. The diplomat contradiction. Let's see how this builds into a really specific legal contradiction the author identifies. The Supreme Court often defends birthright citizenship for unlawful entrants by saying, hey, it's about the baby, not the parents. But the author points out a massive inconsistency here, the diplomat exception. If a foreign diplomat has a child on U.S. soil, that child is denied citizenship specifically because the parent is not subject to the jurisdiction. So clearly the parent's status does matter. The source argues it is a deeply incoherent double standard to claim a parent's foreign status is irrelevant when granting citizenship to an illegal entrant, but totally decisive when denying it to a diplomat. It's essentially asserting a jurisdictional claim over another sovereign citizen's without any principled distinction.
Section 5. The historical context.
To unpack this even further, we need to trace the historical timeline and look at who the framers of the 14th Amendment actually had in mind. We started with the Revolution in 1776, rejecting the subject model. Then jumped to 1866. The debates surrounding the 14th Amendment were overwhelmingly focused on ensuring that freed slaves, people who were already deeply embedded in American society, were unambiguously recognized as citizens. The author emphasizes that those 1866 debates never contemplated modern mass illegal migration or birth tourism. It was completely alien to their world. Yet the current court is taking a limited, context-bound rule and just extrapolating it across a totally different modern era.
The source also tackles the main precedent that always gets cited, the 1898 Wong Kim Ark case. Well, that case actually involved parents who were lawfully resident in the U.S. The author points out that the Supreme Court has never squarely addressed the status of children born to people here illegally. By treating unlawful presence as the functional equivalent of lawful immigrants or freed slaves, the court entirely ignores what the author calls the trespass category. It basically turns administrative convenience into an absolute constitutional mandate, completely ignoring how someone actually entered the country.
Section 6. Consent and self-rule. This brings our explainer to its philosophical climax because, according to the source, the ultimate stakes here go way beyond modern border policy. The most philosophically troubling aspect for the author is this concept of compelled political allegiance. This is the idea that a government can declare someone a citizen without their consent, or conversely force a community to accept someone as a citizen even if the community actively doesn't want to extend that status. The author argues that modern birthright interpretations force individuals and communities right back into the exact kind of non-consensual, permanent subject relationship that the American Republic was explicitly designed to destroy in the first place. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question posed by the author. Can a free people maintain meaningful boundaries around their community of self-rule, or can those boundaries be unilaterally dissolved by those who enter in knowing violation of the community's laws? It is a stark challenge to the current legal consensus. It frames the debate not just as a matter of immigration, but as a fundamental fight over what a nation actually is. It absolutely leaves you with a lot to think about, and I highly encourage you to explore this constitutional debate further. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.